Julian Croft existed in a world of polished glass and chilled air. His office, occupying the entire top floor of the Croft Enterprises Tower, was less a room and more a declaration. It was a testament to a life built on acquisition and control, a kingdom of steel and silence suspended high above the sprawling city. From this perch, the world below was a silent, intricate map of assets and liabilities. People were numbers on a screen, buildings were entries in a portfolio, and life was a series of transactions, each one colder and more precise than the last. He commanded this empire with a quiet, unyielding authority that cowed competitors and inspired a terrified sort of loyalty in his subordinates. But the authority was a shell, the silence a shroud. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection a severe silhouette against the evening sky. The city lights began to flicker on, a galaxy of captured stars, but they offered no warmth. They only served to highlight the profound emptiness in his own chest, a hollow space that wealth could furnish but never fill. Years ago, that space had been occupied by laughter, by the warmth of a small hand in his, by the scent of his wife's perfume. Now, it was just a vacuum, an ache that had dulled over time into a permanent state of being. He turned from the window, his gaze sweeping over the sterile perfection of his office. The leather chair, the mahogany desk, the abstract art on the walls, it was all just scenery for a play whose protagonist had long since forgotten his lines. A junior executive, a young man named Peterson with eager eyes and a nervous tremor in his hands, stood waiting by the door. He had been there for 5 minutes, a silent statue of ambition. "The quarterly projections, Mr. Croft," Peterson said, his voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the mausoleum's quiet. Julian didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on a point in the middle distance. "Leave them on the desk." "Yes, Mr. Croft." "And the board meeting tomorrow." "Has anything changed since this morning, Peterson?" Julian's voice was flat, a blade of ice. "No, Mr. Croft." "Then my preparations have not changed either. You are dismissed." The young man scurried out, the closing of the heavy door sealing Julian once again in his gilded cage. He sat behind the massive desk, the polished surface reflecting his own weathered face. He looked older than his 48 years. Grief was a cruel artist, it had etched lines of permanent sorrow around his eyes and mouth. He ran a hand over his face, the routine of the day, of the year, of the last decade, pressing down on him. It was a relentless cycle of meetings, decisions, and profit margins, a life of immense power that felt, in the quiet moments, like no life at all. The hum of wealth whispered from every corner of the room, a lonely, desolate sound. Hours later, long after the last ambitious executive had gone home, a different kind of life stirred in the silent halls of Croft Enterprises. Arthur Penhaligon moved through the building like a ghost, a quiet shadow in the echoing corridors of power. His world was not one of glass and steel, but of worn linoleum, the faint scent of cleaning solution, and the gentle rhythm of methodical work. For 8 hours a night, he erased the traces of the day's relentless commerce, buffing floors that would be scuffed by expensive shoes, emptying bins filled with discarded ambitions, and wiping down surfaces that would host the next day's power plays. He was a man rendered invisible by his function. The people who bustled through these halls by day would not recognize him. They saw the clean floors, not the man who polished them. They saw the empty trash cans, not the hands that emptied them. And Arthur preferred it that way. Invisibility was a form of peace. It allowed him to work, to provide, and to retreat into the small, carefully guarded world that held all his meaning, a modest 2-bedroom apartment and a 10-year-old daughter named Clara. His cleaning cart was his mobile station, an island of humble purpose in an ocean of corporate grandeur. Tucked into one of its pockets, held by a rubber band, was a small, folded drawing. It was a picture of him and Clara in a park, rendered in the exuberant, clumsy lines of a child's hand. The sun in the corner had a wide, smiling face. He would look at it several times a night, a brief communion with his real life, a reminder of the why behind the monotonous what. He was a widower, and Clara was his sun, his moon, and all his stars. Every swish of his mop, every wipe of his cloth, was for her. It was to keep their small world intact, to ensure her smile never faded. Tonight, his route took him to the top floor. The executive wing. It always felt different up here. The air was thinner, the silence heavier. The carpets were so plush they swallowed the sound of his cart's wheels. It felt like trespassing in a temple dedicated to a god he didn't believe in. He moved with his usual quiet efficiency, his presence a soft counterpoint to the building's sharp, imposing angles. He entered the corner office, the kingdom of Julian Croft. The room was dark, save for the ambient glow of the city lights pouring through the massive windows. Arthur never turned on the main lights. He preferred to work in the shadows, it felt more respectful. As he emptied a small bin beside the desk, his foot nudged something on the floor. He glanced down. It was a man's wallet. Thick. Made of dark, expensive-looking leather. Arthur picked it up. It felt heavy, substantial. He knew he should leave it on the desk, but protocol was to identify the owner if possible. He opened it, his weathered fingers gentle against the soft leather. The first thing he saw was cash. A startling amount of it. $100 bills, a thick wedge that would solve a month's worth of his problems, maybe more. For a fleeting second, the image of a new winter coat for Clara, of paying off a lingering medical bill, flashed through his mind. It was a primal, desperate spark, extinguished as quickly as it came. He was not that man. He pushed the cash aside, looking for a driver's license. He found it, Julian Croft. The name of the building itself. Beneath the license, tucked into a worn plastic sleeve, was a photograph. It was old, the colors faded. A woman with a brilliant, unreserved smile stood beside a young boy with missing front teeth, his arms slung around her neck. They were squinting in bright sunlight, a moment of pure, unscripted joy captured on film. Arthur's breath caught in his chest. It was not the money that was valuable in this wallet. It was this. This small, paper rectangle. He knew the hollow ache of looking at old photographs. He knew what it was to have a life that existed only in memory. He felt a sudden, profound pang of empathy for the cold, distant man who ruled this tower. A man he had never met, but whose loss he suddenly, intimately understood. The king was a man, after all. A man who had lost his queen and his prince. Without another moment of hesitation, Arthur closed the wallet. He wiped it carefully with the edge of his clean shirt, as if to remove his own fingerprints from something sacred. He didn't just toss it onto the desk. He placed it precisely in the center of the vast mahogany surface, on the leather blotter, directly in Julian's line of sight. It was an act of deliberate respect. He then turned, took his cart, and continued his work, the image of the smiling woman and boy imprinted on his mind. The wallet and its contents were already forgotten as a temptation, but remembered as a quiet, shared sorrow. The next morning, Julian arrived before dawn, as he always did. The city was still a tapestry of shadow and light. He walked into his office, his mind already churning with market analytics and shareholder concerns. He saw the wallet immediately. It sat on his desk like an offering. A flicker of annoyance went through him. He had been careless. He prided himself on his precision, and this was a rare lapse. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the familiar grain of the leather. He opened it, his first instinct to check the cash. He didn't know why, it was an automatic, cynical reflex born from years of dealing with people who always wanted something. He fanned the bills. It was all there. Every last one. He frowned. That was unexpected. In his world, opportunity was never ignored. An unattended wallet stuffed with cash was an opportunity. Then his eyes fell on the photograph. The plastic sleeve was slightly askew, as if it had been looked at. His heart gave a painful, unfamiliar lurch. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling slightly. His wife, Sarah. His son, Thomas. Laughter frozen in time, on a day he could barely remember without a wave of nausea. He hadn't looked at this picture in years, though he carried it with him every day. It was a penance, a private memorial he kept close to his chest. The fact that someone had seen this, had held this remnant of his shattered life in their hands, and had simply returned it, felt like a breach. A strange, unnerving, and yet profoundly moving breach. Who in this building, a place teeming with ambition and self-interest, would do such a thing? He immediately went to the monitor on his credenza and pulled up the security logs. He rewound the footage from the previous night, his finger tapping impatiently on the desk. There. 11:47 p.m. The janitor. A man he had never noticed before, slight of build, with quiet, economical movements. Julian watched intently as the man, Arthur Penhaligon, according to the employee file he quickly pulled up on his tablet, found the wallet. He saw him open it. He saw him pause. Julian leaned closer to the screen, his breath held. He watched the man's gaze soften as he looked at the photograph. He saw him gently close the wallet, wipe it, and place it with such care on the desk. Then the man simply turned and continued mopping the floor. There was no hesitation. No furtive glances. No internal debate. Just a simple, clean, honest action. Julian sat back in his chair, a feeling he couldn't name stirring within him. It was a mixture of shock, confusion, and a sliver of something that felt dangerously like hope. He watched the footage again. In the janitor's quiet dignity, in his simple, unrewarded act of integrity, Julian saw a quality of character he hadn't encountered in a very long time. It was a currency his billions could not buy. He spent the rest of the morning distracted. The numbers on the screen seemed meaningless. The urgent emails felt trivial. The ghost of that honest act haunted the sterile air of his office. He had to understand it. He had to understand the man. By midday, he had made a decision. He buzzed his assistant. Find Arthur Penhaligon. The night janitor. Have him come to my office at the start of his shift tonight. The janitor, Mr. Croft, his assistant asked, her voice laced with surprise. You heard me, Julian said, his tone leaving no room for questions. He cut the connection. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about the market, or the board, or the bottom line. He was thinking about a man who mopped his floors. That evening, Arthur arrived for his shift and was met by the floor supervisor, a man who usually barely acknowledged his existence. Penhaligon. You're wanted. Top floor. Arthur's heart sank. The top floor? He could only imagine he had done something wrong. Perhaps he wasn't supposed to have touched the wallet. Perhaps he had breached some unwritten rule of the elite. He felt a quiet dread as the elevator ascended, the floors ticking by like a countdown. He was led into the lion's den, Julian Croft's office. The man himself stood by the window, a formidable figure against the glittering backdrop of the city. The room was even more intimidating with him in it. Mr. Penhaligon, Julian said, turning around. His voice was not unkind, but it carried an immense weight. Thank you for coming. Sir, Arthur said, his own voice quiet. He stood by the door, his hands clasped behind his back, feeling utterly out of place. Julian walked to his desk and picked up the wallet. You found this last night? Yes, sir. I put it on your desk. I know, Julian said. He opened it and took out the thick wad of cash. There is $2,000 here. I want you to have it. He held it out. Arthur looked at the money, then back at Julian's impassive face. He felt a strange sort of disappointment. He had expected an accusation, not a transaction. He shook his head softly. No, thank you, sir. Julian's eyebrows knitted together in a faint expression of surprise. I insist. It's a reward. For your honesty. I don't need a reward for being honest, Mr. Croft, Arthur said, his voice polite but firm. I only did what anyone should have done. The wallet wasn't mine to take. This was it. The shocking reaction. The quiet, simple refusal. It landed in the silent room with more force than any shouted argument. Julian stared at Arthur, truly seeing him for the first time. This wasn't false modesty. It wasn't a tactic to angle for more. It was principle. A solid, unshakable thing. Julian felt a crack appear in the icy armor he had worn for a decade. He slowly withdrew his hand and put the money back on the desk. He felt a fool for offering it. He had tried to turn a moment of profound integrity into another cold transaction. He had misjudged the man completely. The photograph, Julian said, his voice suddenly softer, stripped of its corporate authority. You saw the photograph. It wasn't a question. Arthur met his gaze and gave a slight, solemn nod. I did, sir. I'm sorry for your loss. The simple, direct words of sympathy, offered without pity or platitude, struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. No one had spoken to him about his loss so plainly in years. People avoided it, tiptoed around it, or offered syrupy, meaningless condolences. Arthur spoke to him as one man to another, acknowledging a shared human experience that transcended the vast gulf between their stations. A heavy silence settled in the room. Julian walked back to the window, his back to Arthur. That was my wife, Sarah. And my son, Thomas, he said, his voice thick. They died in a car accident 10 years ago. He had not said those words aloud to a stranger, ever. But Arthur did not feel like a stranger. He felt like a confessor, his quiet presence an invitation to unburden a long-held pain. I lost my wife 8 years ago, Arthur replied softly. Cancer. My daughter, Clara, she barely remembers her. Julian turned around slowly. The carefully constructed walls between CEO and janitor, between rich and poor, had crumbled into dust. In their place stood 2 widowers, 2 fathers, 2 men who understood the particular shape of a life hollowed out by grief. You have a daughter, Julian stated, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He finally understood the refusal of the money. A man with a daughter to provide for, a man who clearly wasn't wealthy, had turned down $2,000 on principle. The strength of that was staggering. Yes, sir. She's 10-inch a rare, faint smile touched Arthur's lips. She's the best part of my life. Julian nodded slowly, a deep, unreadable emotion swirling in his eyes. I see. Their meeting ended not with a dismissal, but with a quiet, mutual understanding. Arthur left the office and went back to his duties, but something had shifted. The building no longer felt like just a place of work. And for Julian, sitting alone in his office long after Arthur had gone, the silence was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of a quiet man's integrity, a sound more valuable than any on the stock exchange. The encounter sparked a change in Julian. It was subtle at first, a slight thawing of a frozen landscape. He began to look for Arthur during his nightly shifts. He would find excuses to be in the building late, just to exchange a few words. He would be in the deserted cafeteria when Arthur came to clean it, nursing a cup of coffee. Working late again, Mr. Croft? Arthur would ask, his tone respectful but familiar. Always something to do, Arthur, Julian would reply, though they both knew it was a pretense. Their conversations were simple, quiet affairs. Julian learned about Clara's struggles with math, her love for drawing, and her upcoming school play. He saw a drawing she had made for her father, a vibrant, colorful picture of a smiling cat, taped to the inside of Arthur's cleaning cart. The simple display of paternal love was a stab to Julian's heart, reminding him of the artwork his own son used to bring home, now stored away in boxes he couldn't bear to open. In turn, Arthur began to see past the billionaire tycoon. He saw the profound loneliness in Julian's eyes, the weariness that his expensive suits couldn't hide. He never offered advice or pity. He simply listened. He provided a space where Julian could speak of things other than business. One night, Julian spoke of his son's love for building model airplanes. He had such patient hands, Julian said, his voice distant, staring into his coffee cup. He could spend hours on one small piece. I never had that kind of patience. Children teach us patience, Arthur offered gently. Clara can spend an entire afternoon looking for four-leaf clovers. It used to drive me mad. Now, I find myself looking with her. A sad smile touched Julian's face. It was the first time Arthur had seen him smile. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, but it was there. Julian started seeing his company differently. He began walking the lower floors, not as a CEO on inspection, but as an observer. He saw the tired faces in accounting, the harried staff in shipping, the security guards on their long shifts. For the first time, he saw them not as human resources, but as humans. People with lives as complex and fraught as his own, people with their own Claras and their own private griefs. One evening, a cold, biting wind howled through the city streets. Julian saw Arthur leaving the building, pulling his thin jacket tight against the chill. It was clearly inadequate for the weather. The next day, a package was delivered to the janitorial services office. It was a thick, expensive-looking winter coat. There was no note. But Arthur knew who it was from. He accepted the gift in the spirit it was given, not as charity, but as a gesture of simple, human concern. But their quiet, burgeoning friendship did not go unnoticed. The halls of Croft Enterprises were rife with whispers. Marcus Thorne, an ambitious senior vice president, watched the strange bond between the CEO and the janitor with a mixture of contempt and suspicion. Thorne was a man who believed in hierarchies. He saw Julian's changing demeanor, his new interest in lower-level employees, his frequent late-night chats with a cleaner, as a sign of weakness, of instability. The grieving CEO was losing his edge, Thorne thought, and this janitor was somehow the cause. The coat was the final straw. Thorne saw Julian giving it to Arthur one evening near the employee entrance, a quiet exchange that he twisted in his mind into something sinister. He saw his opportunity. A quick, anonymous call to a gossip columnist he knew, a few carefully chosen words, unstable, grieving, being taken advantage of, inappropriate relationship, and the fuse was lit. The story broke 2 days later. It was a sleek, venomous piece, splashed across a popular online tabloid. The headline screamed, "Grieving Tycoon Cleaned Out?" CEO Julian Croft's bizarre bond with company janitor raises alarms. The article painted Arthur as a cunning manipulator, a gold digger in a janitor's uniform, who was preying on a vulnerable, grief-stricken billionaire. It mentioned the expensive coat, twisting the gesture of kindness into proof of a sordid transaction. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The office, once a place of quiet anonymity for Arthur, became a pit of judgment. The whispers were no longer hushed, they were overt. Colleagues who once gave him a friendly nod now stared at him with open scorn. He heard the snickers as he walked by. The word "gold digger" followed him down the halls like a foul odor. Worse, the cruelty trickled down to his daughter. A classmate brought a printout of the article to school. Clara came home in tears, asking why they were saying such horrible things about her father, the kindest, most honest man she knew. That night, holding his weeping daughter, Arthur felt a kind of despair he hadn't known since his wife's passing. His dignity, the one thing he possessed that could not be bought or sold, was being publicly stripped from him. He felt no anger toward Julian. He knew the man's heart. But he could not subject his daughter, or himself, to this kind of poison. The world Julian inhabited, with its casual cruelty and vicious gossip, was toxic. They had tried to build a small bridge between their two worlds, but now that bridge was on fire. To protect Clara, to protect his own spirit, he had to retreat. The next day, Arthur wrote a short, formal letter of resignation. He left it on the supervisor's desk before his shift would have begun. He didn't say goodbye to Julian. A farewell would be too painful, and it would feel like he was asking for something. His retreat had to be as clean and quiet as his work had always been. When Julian arrived that morning, he felt the charged atmosphere immediately. He saw the article on an employee's screen and a cold fury, the likes of which he hadn't felt in years, seized him. He stormed into his office, his assistant trailing nervously behind him with a copy of Arthur's resignation letter. "He's gone, Mr. Croft," she said softly. "He resigned." Julian took the letter. The neat, simple handwriting was like a punch to the gut. The professional, impersonal words were louder than any accusation. Arthur was gone. The one person who had seen him, the real him, behind the walls of wealth and power, had been driven away by the very world Julian commanded. The small flicker of warmth that Arthur had kindled in his soul was extinguished, and the old, familiar cold came rushing back in, more bitter and biting than ever before. He was alone again, but this time, he truly knew what he was missing. For 2 days, Julian was a storm contained within the walls of his office. He was silent, cold, and utterly terrifying. His executives tiptoed around him, avoiding eye contact. He knew who was behind the leak. Marcus Thorne had been too smug, too self-satisfied. But firing him was not enough. That would be a simple corporate execution. This was personal. This was an attack on the one pure thing he had found in a decade of emptiness. On the 3rd day, Julian made his move. He called an emergency all-hands meeting in the company's largest auditorium. Attendance was mandatory. He also invited the press, including the tabloid that had run the story. Whispers flew. Was he stepping down? Announcing a merger? No one knew what to expect. Julian walked onto the stage, not to the polished lectern, but to the center, standing alone under a single spotlight. He looked out at the sea of faces, employees, board members, journalists, and for a moment, he just stood there in silence. He wasn't the powerful CEO. He looked like a man preparing to give a eulogy. 2 weeks ago, he began, his voice quiet but amplified throughout the hall, "I lost my wallet in my office." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not what they were expecting. It contained a significant amount of cash. More importantly, it contained this. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the faded photograph of his wife and son. His hand was shaking. He held it up. "This is the only picture I have of them. It is the most valuable thing I own." The auditorium fell silent. This was a side of Julian Croft no one had ever seen. The iron-willed tycoon was showing them his scars. The man who found that wallet was a member of our night staff. "His name is Arthur Penhaligon." Julian's voice grew stronger, laced with a raw, protective anger. "He returned it. He did not take a single dollar. When I offered him a reward, he refused it. He said, 'I don't need a reward for being honest, in a world that is constantly transactional, in a company where I see people clawing for every advantage.'" This man showed a level of integrity that should be the bedrock of this entire enterprise. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the front rows where his senior executives sat. His eyes locked onto Marcus Thorne, who suddenly looked very pale. "And how did we, as a company, as a community, repay this act of decency? We slandered him. We dragged his name through the mud. We called him a schemer and a gold digger. We allowed a culture of gossip and suspicion to poison the one good, clean thing that has happened in this building in a very long time." His voice rose, filled with a righteous fury. "This is not the company I want to lead. This is not the culture I will tolerate." He looked directly at Thorne. "Marcus Thorne, you are fired. Your access has been revoked. Security will escort you from the building." Do not bother to clear out your desk, I will have its contents incinerated. A collective gasp went through the room. Furthermore, Julian continued, his voice ringing with conviction, effective immediately, I am personally funding a new initiative within this company. It will be called the Penhaligon Grant. It will be a substantial fund dedicated to providing direct financial assistance to any employee of Croft Enterprises facing personal or medical hardship. It will be administered not by executives, but by a committee of their peers. It will be a testament to the fact that our greatest asset is not our market share, but our humanity. It is named to honor a man who reminded me of that. He was done. He turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned, silent auditorium. It was the most powerful move he had ever made, not because it involved money or strategy, but because it came from the deepest, most broken part of his heart. That evening, Julian drove not to his empty penthouse, but to a modest, walk-up apartment building in a quiet neighborhood he had located through company records. He walked up 3 flights of stairs and knocked on the door of apartment 3B. Arthur opened it. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He saw Julian standing there, and a complex mix of emotions crossed his face, surprise, pain, and a guarded sort of warmth. "Mr. Croft," he said simply. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice softer than it had been all day. "May I come in?" Arthur hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. The apartment was small, humble, but impeccably clean. A half-finished puzzle was on the coffee table, and the aroma of soup lingered in the air. It felt like a home. "I saw what you did," Arthur said quietly, gesturing vaguely towards the small television in the corner. "It was on the news." "It was the only thing to do," Julian replied. He looked at Arthur, his gaze direct and filled with a profound remorse. "I am so sorry, Arthur. I am sorry for the world I brought to your door. I am sorry for the pain it caused you and your daughter." "It wasn't your fault," Arthur said, his voice laced with weariness. "It's the world. Some people can't understand a thing unless they can put a price on it." "I want you to come back," Julian said, the words rushing out. "Not as a janitor. I want you to run the Penhaligon Grant. Who better to understand the people who need it? Who better to lead with compassion and integrity?" Arthur looked at him, searching his face. He saw no pity there, only a desperate, sincere respect. He saw a man who had been transformed, a man who had taken his own pain and used it to build something beautiful. A small voice came from the hallway. "Dad?" Clara stood there in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. She saw Julian and shied back behind her father's legs. Julian's expression softened completely. He knelt, bringing himself down to her level. "Hello, Clara. My name is Julian. Your dad is a very good man. A hero, in fact." Clara peeked out at him, her curiosity overcoming her shyness. Arthur placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a smile of acceptance, of forgiveness. The bridge between their worlds had not burned down. It had been rebuilt, stronger, and forged in the fire of adversity. "I'll think about your offer, Julian," he said. But they both knew he had already accepted. 1 year later, the Penhaligon Grant was a thriving part of Croft Enterprises. Arthur Penhaligon, in a simple but well-fitting suit, was its director. He moved through the halls with the same quiet dignity he always had, but now people saw him. They greeted him with respect and genuine warmth. He was no longer invisible. He was a symbol of the company's new soul. He met with employees, listened to their stories, and dispensed not charity, but support, with the same empathy he had once shown to a grieving billionaire in a lonely office. On a bright Saturday afternoon, Julian was not in his office. He was in a park, the same one from Clara's drawing. The sun was out, and it had a wide, smiling face. He was pushing a laughing Clara on a swing, pushing her higher and higher. Arthur stood nearby, watching them, a look of serene contentment on his face. Julian left the swing set and walked over to Arthur, the two of them watching Clara run off to fly a kite she had made. The sterile coldness had vanished from Julian's eyes, replaced by a permanent warmth. The hollow space in his chest was no longer an ache. It was filled with the sounds of a child's laughter, with the quiet comfort of a true friend. "She's a good kid, Arthur," Julian said softly. "She is," Arthur agreed, his gaze following his daughter. "She has a good heart." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two men from two different worlds, now sharing the same one. A world where a wallet could be more than money, where a kind act could change a life, and where a janitor could teach a billionaire what it truly meant to be rich. They had found in each other not a solution to their grief, but a way to live with it, a way to build a new kind of family from the broken pieces of the past. The kite soared higher in the blue sky, a small, colorful beacon of hope.